It's pretty close.
It's another day. Children come and play with chocolate button.
Chocolate
The
button.
sun is out today. I'll say hello today to chocolate button.
Chocolate button.
I'll teach you how to read and write. Not sure I can ride a bike. We'll go through all the letters and sounds, having lots of fun playing around. It's another day. Children come and play with chocolate button.
Chocolate button.
The sun is out today. I'll say hello today to chocolate button. Chocolate button.
2, 3. Chocolate button. Good morning, Mr. Magpie.
Good morning, I saw in the garden. Bye. I like that.
Hello and welcome to part 2 of Story Time with Chocolate Button. I hope you enjoyed the first part. I am very excited to find out what happens next. So let's have a look. We are reading George's Marvellous Medicine by Roald Dahl, illustrated by Quentin Blake and published by Puffin. Okay, let's get started. The Brown Hen. George stood in the farmyard, looking up at the roof. The old farmhouse had a fine roof of pale red tiles and tall chimneys. There was no sign of Grandma. There was only a song thrush sitting on one of the chimney pots singing a song. The old Wurzels got stuck in the attic, George thought. Thank goodness for that. Suddenly, a tile came clattering down from the roof and fell into the yard. The song thrush took off fast and flew away. Then another tile came down, then half a dozen more, and then, very slowly, like some weird monster rising up from the deep, Grandma's head came through the roof. Then her scrawny neck and the tops of her shoulders. "How am I doing, boy?" she shouted. "What's that for a bash-up?" Don't you think you'd better stop now, Grandma?" George called out. "I have stopped," she answered. "I feel terrific." "Didn't I tell you I had magic powers? Didn't I warn you I had wizardry in the tips of my fingers? But you wouldn't listen to me, would you? You wouldn't listen to your old Grandma." "You didn't do it, Grandma," George shouted back to her. "I did it. I made you a new medicine." "A new medicine? You? What rubbish!" she yelled. I did, George shouted. "You're lying as usual," Grandma yelled. "You're always lying." "I'm not lying, Grandma, I swear I'm not." The wrinkled old face high up on the roof stared down suspiciously at George. "Are you telling me you actually made a new medicine all by yourself?" she shouted. "Yes, Grandma, all by myself." "I don't believe you," she answered. "But I'm very comfortable up here. Fetch me a cup of tea." A brown hen was pecking about in the yard close to where George was standing. The hen gave him an idea. Quickly he uncorked the medicine bottle and poured some of the brown stuff into the spoon. "What's this, Grandma?" he shouted. He crouched down, holding out the spoon to the hen. "Chicken," he said. "Chick, chick, chicken. Come here, have some of this." Chickens are stupid birds and very greedy. They think everything is food. This one thought the spoon was full of corn. It hopped over, it put its head on one side and looked at the spoon. "Come on, chicken," George said. "Good chicken. Chick, chick, chick." The brown hen stretched out its neck towards the spoon and went peck. It got a beakful of medicine. The effect was electric. "Whee!" shrieked the hen, and it shot straight up into the air like a rocket. It went as high as the house. Then down it came again into the yard. Splosh! And there it sat with its feathers all sticking straight out from its body. There was a look of amazement on its silly face. George stood watching it. Grandma up on the roof was watching it too. The hen got to its feet. It was rather shaky. It was making some funny gurgling noises in its throat. Its beak was opening and shutting. It seemed like a pretty sick hen. "You've done it in, you stupid boy," Grandma shouted. "That hen's going to die. Your father'll be after you now. He'll give you socks and serve you right." All of a sudden, black smoke started pouring out of the hen's beak. "It's on fire!" Grandma yelled. "The hen is on fire!" George ran to the water trough to get a bucket of water. "That hen'll be roasted and ready for eating any moment," Grandma shouted. George sloshed the bucket of water over the hen. There was a sizzling sound, and the smoke went away. "Old hen's laid its last egg," Grandma shouted. "Hens don't do anything after they've been on fire." Now that the fire was out, the hen seemed better. It stood up properly. It flapped its wings. Then it crouched down low to the ground, as though getting ready to jump. It did jump. It jumped high in the air and turned a complete somersault, then landed back on its feet. "It's a circus hen," Grandma shouted from the rooftop. "It's a flippin' acrobat." Now the hen began to grow. George had been waiting for this to happen. "It's growing," he yelled. "It's growing, Grandma. Look, it's growing." Bigger and bigger, taller and taller it grew. Soon the hen was 4 or 5 times its normal size. "Can you see it, Grandma?" George shouted. "I can see it, boy," the old girl shouted back. "I'm watching it." George was hopping about from one foot to the other with excitement, pointing at the enormous hen and shouting, "It's had the magic medicine, Grandma, and it's growing just like you did." But there was a difference between the way the hen was growing and the way Grandma grew. When Grandma grew taller and taller, she got thinner and thinner. The hen didn't. It stayed nice and plump all along. Soon it was taller than George, but it didn't stop there. It went right on growing until it was about as big as a horse. Then it stopped. "Doesn't it look marvellous, Grandma?" George shouted. "It's not as tall as me," Grandma sang out. "Compared with me, the hen is titchy small. I am the tallest of them all." The pig, the bullocks, the sheep, the pony, and the nanny goat. At that moment, George's mother came back from shopping in the village. She drove her car into the yard and got out. She was carrying a bottle of milk in one hand and a bag of groceries in the other. The first thing she saw was the gigantic brown hen towering over little George. She dropped the bottle of milk. Then Grandma started shouting at her from the rooftop, and when she looked up and saw Grandma's head sticking up through the tiles, she dropped the bag of groceries. "How about that then, eh, Mary?" Grandma shouted. "I'll bet you've never seen a hen as big as that. That's George's giant hen, that is." But, stammered George's mother. "It's George's magic medicine," Grandma shouted. "We've both of us had it, the hen and I." "But how in the world did you get up on the roof?" cried Mother. "I didn't," crackled the old woman. "My feet are still standing on the floor in the living room." This was too much for George's mother to understand. She just goggled and gaped. She looked as though she was going to faint. A second later, George's father appeared. His name was Mr. Killy Cranky. Mr. Cranky was a small man with bandy legs and a huge head. He was a kind father to George, but he was not an easy person to live with because even the smallest things got him all worked up and excited. The hen standing in the yard was certainly not a small thing, and when Mr. Cranky saw it, he started jumping about as though something was burning his feet. "Great heavens!" he cried, waving his arms. "What's this? What's happened? Where did it come from? It's a giant hen! Who did it?" "I did," George said. "Look at me!" Grandma shouted from the rooftop. "Never mind about the hen. What about me?" Mr. Cranky looked up and saw Grandma. "Oh, shut up, Grandma," he said. It didn't seem to surprise him that the old girl was sticking up through the roof. It was the hen that excited him. He had never seen anything like it. But then, who had? "It's fantastic!" Mr. Cranky shouted, dancing and round. "It's colossal! It's gigantic! It's tremendous! It's a miracle! How did you do it, George?" George started telling his father about the magic medicine. While he was doing this, the big brown hen sat down in the middle of the yard and went cluck, cluck, cluck. Cluck, 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 cluck. Everyone stared at it. When it stood up, there was a brown egg lying there. The egg was the size of a football. "That egg would make scrambled eggs for 20 people, Mrs. Cranky said. "George," Mr. Cranky shouted, "how much of this medicine have you got?" "Lots," George said. "There's a big saucepan in the kitchen, and this bottle here, it's nearly full." "Come with me," Mr. Cranky yelled, grabbing George by the arm. "Bring the medicine. For years and years I've been trying to breed bigger and bigger animals. Bigger bulls for beef, bigger pigs for pork, bigger sheep for mutton." They went to the pigsty first. George gave a spoonful of medicine to the pig. The pig blew smoke from its nose and jumped about all over the place. Then it grew and grew, and in the end it looked like this. Look, there's the... Can you see Chocolate Button? Oh, yes, yeah, there they are. Oh, my goodness, it's an enormous pig. They went to the herd of fine black bullocks that Mr. Cranky was trying to fatten for the market. George gave each of them some medicine, and this is what happened. Look at how big they are. Look, there's the people, George and his dad, for size, for scale. Then the sheep, enormous sheep. He gave some to his grey pony, Jack Frost. And finally, just for fun, he gave some to Alma, the nanny goat. Doing, doing, doing. Look, enormous goat now. A crane for Grandma. Grandma, from high up on the rooftop, could see everything that was going on, and she didn't like what she saw. She wanted to be the centre of attention, and nobody was taking the slightest notice of her. George and Mr. Cranky were running around and getting excited about enormous animals. Mrs. Cranky was washing up in the kitchen, and Grandma was all alone on the rooftop. "Hey, you!" she yelled. "George! Get me a cup of tea this minute, you idle little beast!" "Don't listen to the old goat," Mr. Cranky said. "She's stuck up where she is, and good thing too." "But we can't leave her up there, Dad," George said. "What if it rains?" "George!" Grandma yelled. "Oh, you horrible little boy! You disgusting little worm! Fetch me a cup of tea at once! And a slice of currant cake!" "We'll have to get her out, Dad," George said. "She won't give us a moment's peace if we don't." Mrs. Cranky came outside and she agreed with George. "She's my own mother," she said. "She's a pain in the neck," Mr. Cranky said. "I don't care," Mrs. Cranky said. "I'm not leaving her, my own mother, sitting up through the roof for the rest of her life." So in the end, Mr. Cranky telephoned the crane company, and asked them to send their biggest crane out to the house at once. The crane arrived 1 hour later. It was on wheels and there were 2 men inside it. The crane men climbed up on the roof and put ropes under Grandma's arms. Then she was lifted right up through the roof. In a way, the medicine had done Grandma good. It had not made her any less grumpy or bad-tempered, but it seemed to have cured all of her aches and pains, and she was suddenly as frisky as a ferret. As soon as the crane had lowered her to the ground, she ran over to George's huge pony, Jack Frost, and jumped onto his back. This ancient old hag, who was now as tall as a house, then galloped about the farm on the gigantic pony, jumping over trees and sheds and shouting, "Out of my way! Clear the docks! Stand back! All you miserable midgets, or I'll trample you to death!" And other very silly things like that. But because Grandma was now much too tall to get back into the house, she had to sleep that night in the hay barn with the mice and the rats. Mr. Cranky's Great Idea. The next day, George's father came down to breakfast in a state of greater excitement than ever. "I've been awake all night thinking about it," he cried. "About what, Dad?" George asked him. "About your marvellous medicine, of course. We can't stop now, my boy. We must start making more of it at once. More and more and more." The giant saucepan had been completely emptied the day before because there had been so many sheep and pigs and cows and bullocks to be dosed. "But why do we need more, Dad?" George asked. "We've done all our own animals, and we've made Grandma feel as frisky as a ferret, even though she does have to sleep in the barn." "My dear boy," cried Mr. Killiecranky, "we need barrels and barrels of it, tons and tons. Then we will sell it to every farmer in the world, so that all of them can have giant animals. We will build a marvellous medicine factory and sell the stuff in bottles at £5 a time. We will become rich, and you will become famous." "But wait a minute, Dad," George said. "There's no waiting," cried Mr. Cranky, working himself up so much that he put in his coffee and milk. He put butter in his coffee and milk on his toast. "Don't you understand what this tremendous invention of yours is going to do to the world? Nobody will ever go hungry again." "Why won't they?" asked George. "Because 1 cow will fill 50 buckets of milk a day," cried Mr. Cranky, waving his arms. "1 giant chicken will make 100 fried chicken dinners, and 1 giant pig will give you 1,000 pork chops. It's tremendous, my dear boy. It's fantastic. It will change the world." "But wait a minute, Dad," George said again. "Don't keep saying wait a minute," shouted Mr. Cranky. "There isn't a minute to wait. We must get cracking at once." "Do calm down, my dear," Mrs. Cranky said from the other end of the kitchen table, "and stop putting marmalade on your cornflakes." "The yak with my cornflakes!" cried Mr. Cranky, leaping up from the chair. "Come on, George, let's get going, and the first thing we'll do is make 1 more saucepanful as a tester." "But, Dad," said little George, "the trouble is—" "There won't be any trouble, my boy," cried Mr. Cranky. "How can there possibly be any trouble? All you've got to do is put the same stuff into the saucepan as you did yesterday, and while you're doing it, I'll write down each and every item. That's how we'll get the magic recipe." "But, Dad," George said, "please listen to me." "Why don't you listen to him?" Mrs. Cranky said. "The boy's trying to tell you something." But Mr. Cranky was too excited to listen to anyone except himself. "And then," he cried, "when the new mixture is ready, we'll test it out on an old hen, just to make absolutely sure we've got it right, and after that we'll all shout hooray and build the giant factory." "But, Dad—" "Come on then, what is it that you want to say?" "I can't possibly remember all of the hundreds of things I put into the saucepan to make the medicine," George said. "Of course you can, my dear boy," cried Mr. Cranky. "I'll help you. I'll jog your memory. You'll get it in the end. You see if you don't. Now then, what was the very first thing you put in?" "I went up to the bathroom first," George said. "I used a lot of things in the bathroom and Mummy's dressing table." "Come on then," cried Mr. Killycranky. "Up we go to the bathroom." When they got there, they found, of course, a whole lot of empty tubes and empty aerosols and empty bottles. "That's great," said Mr. Cranky. "That tells us exactly what you used. If anything is empty, it means you used it." So Mr. Cranky started making a list of everything that was empty in the bathroom. Then they went to Mrs. Cranky's dressing table. "A box of powder," said Mr. Cranky, writing it down. "Helga's hair set. Flowers of turnips perfume. Terrific. This is going to be easy. Where did you go next?" "To the laundry room," George said. "But are you sure we haven't missed anything out up here, Dad?" "That's up to you, my boy," Mr. Cranky said. "Have I?" "I don't think so," George said. So down they went to the laundry room, and once again Mr. Cranky wrote down the names of all the empty bottles and cans. "My goodness me, what a mass of stuff you used!" he cried. "No wonder it did magic things. Is that the lot?" "No, Dad, it's not," George said, and he led his father out to the shed where the animal medicines were kept and showed him the 5 big empty bottles on the shelf. Mr. Cranky wrote down all their names. "Anything else?" Mr. Cranky asked. Little George scratched his head and thought, but he couldn't remember having put anything else in. Mr. Killycranky leapt into his car and drove down to the village and bought new bottles and tubes and cans of everything on his list. He then went to the vet and got a fresh supply of all the animal medicines George had used. "Now, show me how you did it, George," he said. "Come along, show me exactly how you mixed them all together." Do you think that George has remembered all of the ingredients? I don't. Like, for example, where's the powder puff thing? That's supposed to be floating on the top, isn't it? And I think he used some lipsticks, but I can't remember how many. Can you remember? Right, on to the next chapter. Marvellous Medicine number 2. They were in the kitchen now, and the big saucepan was on the stove. All the things Mr. Cranky had brought were lined up near the sink. "Come along, my boy," cried Mr. Killycranky. "Which ones did you put in first?" "This one," George said. "Golden Gloss Hair Shampoo." He emptied the bottle into the pan. "Now the toothpaste," George went on, "and the shaving soap, and the face cream, and the nail varnish." "Keep at it, my boy," cried Mr. Cranky, dancing round the kitchen. "Keep putting them in. Don't stop, don't pause, don't hesitate. It's a pleasure, my dear fellow, to watch you work." One by one, George poured and squeezed the things into the saucepan. With everything so close at hand, the whole job didn't take him more than 10 minutes. But when it was all done, the saucepan didn't somehow seem to be quite as full as it had been the first time. "Now, what did you do?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Did you stir it?" "I boiled it," George said, "but not for long, and I stirred it as well." So Mr. Cranky lit the gas under the saucepan, and George stirred the mixture with the same long wooden spoon he had used before. "It's not brown enough," George said. "Wait a minute, I know what I've forgotten." "What?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Tell me quick, because if we've forgotten even one tiny thing, it won't work. At least not in the same way." "A quart of brown gloss paint," George said. "That's what I've forgotten." Mr. Killycranky shot out of the house and into his car like a rocket. He sped down to the village and bought the paint and rushed back again. He opened the can in the kitchen and handed it to George. George poured the paint into the saucepan. "Aha, that's better," George said. "That's more like the right colour." "It's boiling," cried Mr. Cranky. "It's boiling and bubbling, George. Is it ready yet?" "It's ready," George said. "At least I hope it is." "Right," shouted Mr. Cranky, hopping about. "Let's test it. Let's give some to a chicken." "My heavens alive! Why don't you calm down a bit?" Mrs. Cranky said, coming into the kitchen. "Calm down?" cried Mr. Cranky. "You expect me to calm down? And here we are mixing up the greatest medicine ever discovered in the history of the world. Come along, George, dip a cupful of that saucepan and get a spoon, and we'll get some to the chicken just to make absolutely certain we've got the correct mixture. Outside in the yard there were several chickens that hadn't had any of George's marvellous medicine number 1. They were pecking about in the dirt in the silly way that chickens do. George crouched down, holding out a spoonful of marvellous medicine number 2. "Come on, chicken," he said. "Good chicken. Chick, chick, chick." A white chicken with black specks on its feathers looked up at George. It walked over to the spoon and went peck. The effect that medicine number 2 had on this chicken was not quite the same as the effect produced by medicine number 1, but it was very interesting. "Whoosh!" shrieked the chicken, and it shot 6 feet up into the air and came down again. Then sparks came flying out of its beak, bright yellow sparks of fire, as though someone was sharpening a knife on a grindstone inside its tummy. Then its legs began to grow longer. Its body stayed the same size, but the 2 thin yellow legs got longer and longer and longer, and longer still. "What's happening to it?" cried Mr. Killiecranky. "Something's wrong," George said. The legs went on growing, and the more they grew, the higher up in the air went the chicken's body. When the legs were about 15 feet long, they stopped growing. The chicken looked perfectly absurd, with its long, long legs and its ordinary little body perched high up on top. It was a little chicken on stilts. "Oh, my sainted aunts!" cried Mr. Killiecranky. "We've got it wrong. This chicken's no good to anybody. It's all legs. No one wants chicken's legs." "I must have left something out," George said. "I know you left something out," cried Mr. Cranky. "Think, boy, think. What was it you left out?" "I've got it," said George. "What was it? Quick." "Flea powder for dogs," George said. "You mean you put flea powder in the first one?" "Yes, Dad, I did. A whole carton of it." "Then that's the answer." "Wait a minute," said George. "Did we have brown shoe polish on our list?" "We did not," said Mr. Cranky. "I used that too," said George. "Well, no wonder it went wrong," said Mr. Cranky. He was already running to his car, and soon he was heading down to the village to buy more flea powder and more shoe polish. Have you remembered anything else that George has forgotten? Oh my goodness! Right, let's find out what happens next. Marvellous medicine number 3. "Here it is," cried Mr. Killiecranky, rushing into the kitchen. "1 carton of flea powder for dogs and 1 tin of brown shoe polish." George poured the flea powder into the giant saucepan. Then he scooped the shoe polish out of its tin and added that as well. "Stir it up, George," shouted Mr. Cranky. "Give it another boil. We've got it this time. I bet we've got it." After marvellous medicine number 3 had been boiled and stirred, George took a cupful of it out into the yard to try it on another chicken. Mr. Cranky ran after him, flapping his arms and hopping with excitement. "Come and watch this one," he called out to Mrs. Cranky. "Come and watch us turning an ordinary chicken into a lovely great big one that lays eggs as large as footballs." "I hope you do better than last time," said Mrs. Cranky, following them out. "Come on, chicken." "Come on, chicken," said George, holding out a spoonful of medicine number 3. "Good chicken. Chick, 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 chick. Here, have some of this lovely medicine." A magnificent black cockerel with a scarlet comb came stepping over. The cockerel looked at the spoon, and it went peck. "Cock-a-doodle-doo!" squawked the cockerel, shooting up into the air and coming down again. "Watch him now!" cried Mr. Cranky. "Watch him grow. Any moment he's going to start getting bigger and bigger." Mr. Killiecranky, Mrs. Cranky and little George stood in the yard staring at the black cockerel. The cockerel stood quite still. It looked as though it had a headache. "What's happening to its neck?" Mrs. Cranky said. "It's getting longer," George said. I'll say it's getting longer, Mrs. Cranky said. Mr. Cranky for once said nothing. Last time it was the legs, Mrs. Cranky said. Now it's the neck. Who wants a chicken with a long neck? You can't eat a chicken's neck. It was an extraordinary sight. The cockerel's body hadn't grown at all, but the neck was now about 6 feet long. All right, George, Mr. Cranky said. What else have you forgotten? I don't know, George said. Oh, yes, you do, Mr. Cranky said. Come along, boy, think. There's probably just one vital thing missing, and you've got to remember it. I put in some engine oil from the garage, George said. Do you have that on your list? Eureka! Cried Mr. Cranky. That's the answer. How much did you put in? Half a pint, George said. Mr. Cranky ran to the garage and found another half pint of oil. And some antifreeze, George called after him. I sloshed in a bit of antifreeze. Marvellous medicine number 4. Back in the kitchen once again, George, with Mr. Cranky watching him anxiously, tipped half a pint of engine oil and some antifreeze into the giant saucepan. Boil it up again, cried Mr. Cranky. Boil it up and stir it. George boiled it and stirred it. You'll never get it right, said Mrs. Cranky. Don't forget, you don't just have to have the same things, but you've got to have the exact same amounts of those things. And how can you possibly do that? You keep out of this, cried Mr. Cranky. We're doing fine. We've got it this time. You see if we haven't. This was George's marvellous medicine number 4. And when it boiled for a couple of minutes, George once again carried a cupful of it out into the yard. Mr. Cranky ran after him. Mrs. Cranky followed more slowly. You're going to have some mighty strange chickens around here if you go on like this, she said. Dish it out, George, cried Mr. Cranky. Give a spoonful to that one over there. He pointed to the brown hen. George knelt down and held out the spoon with the new medicine in it. Chick, chick, he said. Try some of this. The brown hen walked over and looked at the spoon. Then it went peck. Ouch! It said. Then a funny whistling came out of its beak. Watch it grow, shouted Mr. Cranky. Don't be too sure, said Mrs. Cranky. Why is it whistling like that? Keep quiet, woman, cried Mr. Cranky. Give it a chance. Then they stood there staring at the brown hen. It's getting smaller, George said. Look at it, Dad. It's shrinking. And indeed it was. In less than a minute, the hen had shrunk so much it was no bigger than a new hatched chick. It looked ridiculous. Goodbye, Grandma. There's still something you've left out, Mr. Cranky said. I can't think what it could be. Give it up, Mrs. Cranky said. Pack it in. You'll never get it right. Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with the spoon in one hand and the cupful of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the 3 people below her, and she shouted, What's going on down here? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the yard with the rats and the mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs and bacon, no buttered toast. I'm sorry, Mother, Mrs. Cranky said. We've been terribly busy. I'll get you some right away. Let George get it, the lazy little brute, Grandma shouted. Just then the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. Ho, ho! She cried. Aha! Ah, so that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? You make quite sure you've got a nice cup of tea in the morning, but you didn't think to bring one to your poor old grandma. I always knew you were selfish. No, Grandma, George said. This isn't. Don't lie to me, boy, the enormous old hag shouted. Pass it up here this minute. No, cried Mrs. Cranky. No, Mother, don't. That's not for you. Now you're against me too, shouted Grandma. My own daughter trying to stop me having my breakfast, trying to starve me out. Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman and he smiled sweetly. Of course it's for you, Grandma, he said. You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot. Don't think I won't, Grandma said, bending down for her great height and reaching out a huge horny hand for the cup. Hand it over, George. No, no, Grandma, George cried out, pulling the cup away. You mustn't. You're not to have it. Give it to me, boy, yelled Grandma. Don't, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's George's, Marvellous. Everything's George's around here, shouted Grandma. George is this, George is that. I'm fed up with it. She snatched the cup out of little George's hand and carried it high up out of reach. Drink it, Grandma, Mr. Cranky said, grinning hugely. Lovely tea. No, the other two cried. No, no, no. But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. Dun, dun, dun. Mother, wailed Mrs. Cranky, you've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine No. 4. And look, one tiny spoonful did to that little brown hen. But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. This is going to be interesting, Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. Now you've done it, cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. You've cooked the old girl's goose. I didn't do anything, Mr. Cranky said. Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it. A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. She'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam, Mr. Cranky said. She's going to blow up, Mrs. Cranky wailed. Her boiler's going to burst. Stand clear, Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill it hurt the ears. Call the fire brigade, cried Mrs. Cranky. Call the police. Man the hose pipes. Too late, cried Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. Grandma, shrieked Mrs. Cranky. Mother, run to the drinking trough and put your head under the water. But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped, and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She had started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. Watch this, George, Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. Watch what happens when someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of 1. Very soon Grandma was back to normal height. Stop, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's just right. But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half a minute she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. How do you feel, Mother? Asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression it had always had. Her eyes, no bigger than little keyholes, were blazing with anger. How do I feel? She yelled. How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant a minute ago and suddenly you're a miserable midget? She's still going, shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. She's still getting smaller. And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and she cried, "How do I stop her getting smaller still?" "You can't," cried Mr. Cranky. "She's had 50 times the right amount." "I must stop her," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "I can hardly see her as it is." "Catch hold of the end and pull," Mr. Cranky said. By then Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking fast. A moment later she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed, then... "Where is she?" cried Mrs. Cranky. "I've lost her." "Hooray!" cried Mr. Cranky. "She's gone. She's disappeared completely," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's what happens to you if you're grumpy and bad-tempered," said Mr. Cranky. "Great medicine of yours, George." George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, "Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you?" But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, "Ah, well, I suppose it's all for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she?" "Yes," Mr. Cranky said, "she most certainly was." George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments he had touched with the very tips of his fingers the edge of a magic world. The end. Oh my goodness, that was amazing, wasn't it? I loved that book. Thank you very much, Shirley and Amani, for recommending that book, because it really was really funny, and it's a bit shocking, isn't it, at the end there? My goodness, so Grandma just disappears. She gets so small that she just poof disappears, and the family are not that sad about it, are they? It's a very interesting story, isn't it? Because we have to be, what it's kind of saying is, be careful what you wish for, isn't it? Because Grandma thought she wanted lots of things, and then when she got them, oh my goodness, her life was not made better. And George too, he wanted lots of things, and then when he got them, oof, it wasn't quite how he'd imagined it, was it? No. Gosh. Well, I hope you enjoyed this wonderful book, and I hope that if you've enjoyed it, that you might start reading some of the other books altogether. So you could read lots of other things. There's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, and there's one of my favourites is called Matilda, and that's really good. Maybe when you're a little bit older as well. And then there's, well, James and the Giant Peach, we already read that one, didn't we? The Twits, we've already read that one. So many Roald Dahl books, but he was really fantastic. So please do have a look and keep a lookout for Roald Dahl. But also remember to keep trying new books by new authors, because there are so many out there for you to try, and so many written for you with maybe pictures of you in them, or people who look like you in them. So please do keep reading new books as well, and trying out all of those. If you want any recommendations, please do ask me or Lucy, because we have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of ideas about what would be good for you to read and what you might enjoy. So please do ask us, and you can ask us whenever you like. Even when you're in year 1, you can still ask us. Okay? Fantastic. Well, I am going to give you some ideas of things you can do, all based around George's Marvellous Medicine, for the next couple of days, as well as your Marvellous Me work. So I cannot wait to see what you get up to. Okay, but for now, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon. Bye, bye, elbow bump, bye.